Hey, this is Paul Baloff, and you better fucking watch Reality Check or die!
Founded by Kirk Hammett but abandoned when trouble started brewing in the early thrash camp of Metallica, thanks to Dave Mustaine.
Exodus!
Before Kirk Hammett was a household name in Metallica, he was a teenager in a rehearsal room helping Gary Holt and Tom Hunting invent a genre. They became the ultimate what-if story, plagued by record label delays, lineup changes, and the cruel timing of a shifting industry. Whilst the Black Album made megastars of the likes of Hetfield and Ulrich, these guys were broke and about to return to grueling 9-to-5 jobs, leaving the stage and spotlights behind. From the blood-soaked basement tapes of 1982 to the major label chaos of the early 90s, their story is one of raw power and missed opportunities. This is Bonded by Blood, the story of Exodus.
They say Thrash is dead,
but we say bullshit!
Exodus would officially form around 1979, and one of the founding members would be Kirk Hammett. The very early Exodus lineup was, I guess you could say, unstable to say the least. And for a brief time, the drummer Tom Hunting was also their vocalist. And from what Kirk Hammett has stated in interviews, this very, very early musings of the group started out when Hammett began to have sessions with Tom Hunting, who would be with Exodus for their first few recordings. And as always, when we're looking at a group from this era, especially thrash or metal in general, they always look to the same inspirations such as Judas Priest or Iron Maiden, and overall, the new wave of British heavy metal. As a kid growing up in the late 70s, I was just looking for the hardest thing I could find. I was way into UFO and Judas Priest and Thin Lizzy, and I had recently discovered the new wave of British heavy metal and this stuff that was going on in Europe. I gravitated to it. I started playing those songs, and my guitar style started to incorporate facets of what all of those bands were doing. UFO is generally not a band that is often associated with inspiring or influencing thrash music or musicians, but they do get a couple of mentions here and there. UFO are essentially an English rock band. Their debut studio album, UFO 1, released in 1970, was followed by several more records in the 70s. 7 studio albums in total from this decade. And if you want my personal recommendations here, I'd check out Force It from 1975 and No Heavy Petting from 1976. Again with Thin Lizzy, not a group often cited when it comes to the overall history of thrash metal. But here it definitely makes sense, as many of you will know, Metallica released a cover version of Whiskey in the Jar in 1998, which was originally released by Thin Lizzy as a rock song way back in 1972. However, Whiskey in the Jar dates back to the 17th century as a traditional Irish folk song and was also released by the Dubliners before Thin Lizzy. But for now, let's close that little subfolder and get back to Exodus. Hammett gave a little insight into the early formations of Exodus in an interview with Metal Hammer a few years ago. When I formed Exodus and I started jamming with Tom Hunting, I turned him onto all of these bands and said, this is what we've got to do. We've got to do something like this. I don't know if you know Tom Hunting, but he's a very high-strung person. He's always shaking or tapping on something or hitting something. And when he plays drums, he's kind of that way too. Whenever we'd play a song in the beginning, it started at a certain tempo, but 3 or 4 weeks later, it would be twice as fast. And so when we started writing songs, that's why the beats per minute were up there. Because Tom Hunting had a lot of nervous energy, a lot like Lars. Hammett and Hunting would eventually come across Gary Holt, who would become one of the longest standing members of the group. The setting for this meeting would be Richmond High School in California. I'd grown up in the 70s on a steady diet of the commercial hard rock that my older brothers fed me. AC/DC, Ted Nugent, Nazareth, Montrose, Molly Hatchet, Lynyrd Skynyrd, The Outlaws, and Blackfoot. But when my friends and I heard that first Iron Maiden album and those early Angel Witch and Venom 7-inch singles in 1980 and 81, everything changed. This music was heavier, darker, rougher, at times faster and eviler. Though some bands from the new wave of British heavy metal were signed to major labels, nothing about Iron Maiden's 7-minute epic Phantom of the Opera on their debut or Angel Witch's Angel of Death suggested they would ever be played on the radio. Hard rock played a huge part in the early influencing of many musicians from the early Bay Area thrash scene. The debut by Angel Witch is again a record that doesn't get enough attention when we consider the early origins of this era of heavy metal. The debut record by Angel Witch probably inspired more thrash musicians than any of us realize. It was released in 1980, and it absolutely had an evil vibe about it. And remember, this was a year before Venom released Welcome to Hell in 1981. And yes, Angel Witch also had a song called Angel of Death, released 6 years before Slayer's Angel of Death. The topic of Angel Witch's release, though, was definitely not about Joseph Mengele. The offering by Angel Witch focused on myth, magic, and the devil to a certain extent. It was by no means a satanic record, though. Hammett would also introduce Holt to Scorpions, with a specific focus on the epic twiddlings of guitarist Uli Jon Roth, who, in my opinion, is without doubt one of the greatest guitar players of all time. Nobody else sounds like this guy. Holt and Hammett also went to a Scorpions show early on in their friendship, May the 23rd, 1980 to be precise. I got to know Kirk better when he and I went to see the Scorpions and Ted Nugent on May the 23rd, 1980 at the Cow Palace. It was the first time we'd spent a day or evening together, and we just hit it off as best friends right away. Before the concert, he invited me over to his house for some pre-show partying and played one of the Scorpions' earlier Uli Roth era albums, Virgin Killer, which eventually had a huge influence on me as a guitarist. I had never heard of early Scorpions until that day, and it changed my life. There's a reason I did not show that cover of the record, you can Google it. Hammett also gave Holt his first guitar lesson, and some of Exodus's early shows included covers of Judas Priest, Def Leppard, and Scorpions. Exodus themselves would release an early demo cassette in 1982. Around the same time, the Bay Area thrash scene was developing into something much more than just a bunch of kids thrashing around at backyard keg parties. In 1982, we obviously had no idea that this music would make it beyond the backyard parties or the Bay Area clubs. In fact, it seemed really unlikely. As far as we were concerned, we were making music for a small minority, the tape traders, the hardcore devotees, the true headbangers, with no concern for what was going on in the mainstream. This was music that shared DNA with the hardcore punk that was developing on both coasts and creeping out of the UK. And it was similarly staunchly independent. We knew major labels didn't want any part of this and wouldn't even know what to do with it. So we made zero concessions in our music, lyrics, and artwork. We just wanted to be heavy. And I'm pretty sure that no major record label saw that as a marketable attribute. The 1982 Exodus demo is officially labeled as heavy metal and speed metal. And you can absolutely hear the influence of groups such as Angel Witch and Iron Maiden, along with Priest and the general new wave of British heavy metal movement. The demo itself only consisted of 3 songs, but it's a great insight into the early sound of Exodus. And of course, in the same year, we had the No Life Till Leather demo by Metallica and the Metal Blade Records compilation album Metal Massacre, which featured Metallica. Maybe this was one of the reasons Hammett had decided to leave Exodus behind and join Metallica.
No, I don't know where this place is, no.
Coincidentally, the first Exodus show also happened to be opening for Metallica in San Francisco. And a funny little comment Gary Holt made about this show was stating that Lars was still definitely learning to play the drums at this time. Many would say he still is. Rat fact also featured on the Metal Massacre record. However, I don't think Exodus were fans of this band, or not publicly anyway, as Holt recalled in an interview some years later. In the Baloff era in Exodus, if someone showed up with a rat shirt, we'd pull out the pocket knife and cut strips off of the shirt. If you look at some of the old photos of Baloff, he's got all these pieces of cloth, like for 3 inches, tied around his wrist. Those are threads of a poser shirt. But at the same time, us guitar players were secretly coveting every Warren DeMartini riff like the sickest, greatest guitar player on earth with the best tone ever, him and Robin. So we were like actively sitting there listening to him and George Lynch. Metallica was scheduled to record their debut record, Kill 'Em All, and after Dave Mustaine had been fired, they obviously scouted for a new guitarist, which would of course be Hammett. Exodus, though, weren't too happy about Hammett's abrupt departure. We had a vision, and then Metallica came along, and it looked like they'd been at it for a good 6 or 8 months longer than we had been at it, and had all these similar influences. I've said this before, and I'll say it again, but I thought, these guys are great, but they'd be so much better with me. I told the guys in Exodus, and they were pissed. They were pissed. I remember Paul Baloff was so pissed that he poured a beer over my head. He said, "I can't believe you're doing this, Kirk." Then poured his beer over my head. I just took it. Yeah, I know. Many years later, Hammett would also claim that much of the material that would feature on the debut Exodus record was actually written by him. You know, I also left a lot of music with those guys. A lot of the music I wrote ended up on that first album, and they recorded some other songs that never made it. I never said anything because of the way I left them. I always had guilty feelings about that. Well, not anymore. That sounds really familiar. Where have I heard something like this said before? I wonder if Metallica realized they fired Dave Mustaine and then just hired a bargain basement version of him as a replacement.
This guy wants an interview. Yeah, sure.
Nevertheless, the album Hammett is referring to is of course the absolutely epic debut studio album by Exodus called Bonded by Blood. Released in 1985 via Combat Records in the US, Combat are most notably known for releasing Megadeth's debut Killing Is My Business and Business Is Good. And although Exodus were a little late to the party, with Metallica having released Kill 'Em All in 1983 and Ride the Lightning in 84, this was pretty much the pinnacle era for the rise of thrash metal. And do I need to mention Slayer's Show No Mercy or Anthrax's Fistful of Metal? Bonded by Blood was, and still is, an incredible example of thrash with a solid new wave of British heavy metal influence, filled with aggression.
Hey, this is Paul Baloff, and you better fucking watch Reality Check or die!
It's also the only Exodus album to feature the vocals of Paul Baloff, as he would be replaced by Steve Souza, who would come to be known as part of the classic Exodus lineup. Exodus built up a bit of hype around the release of their debut record thanks to the cassette tape trading scene that was happening at the time, and of course via the general Bay Area thrash scene as well. They even managed to have the album reviewed by the once mighty Kerrang! Magazine over in the UK. And here also raises a point of common debate within the metal community. Bonded by Blood was actually due to be released in 1984, but due to creative conflict and issues with their record label, it basically sat on the shelves for a year. So naturally, some people argue that Bonded by Blood could have easily gone up against Ride the Lightning by Metallica, or predated Halloween by Slayer in 1985, and brought the band significant exposure before the likes of Megadeth's debut record. Although Exodus didn't see any huge commercial success with their debut album, they had absolutely delivered their metal command to the masses and were ready to feel the flesh. In 1985, an unknown thrash band called Legacy would record a demo cassette called Demo 1. The singer would be Steve Souza. This group legacy would go on to become Testament, releasing their debut album in 1987 called The Legacy. While Steve Souza received writing credits on this record, he had already joined Exodus before its release. The decision to bring Souza on board wasn't an easy one. Paul Baloff, who had delivered some pretty impressive vocals on Exodus's debut album, was struggling to control his party lifestyle. After the debut record, Exodus had signed a new record deal with Combat Records. Previously, Combat was simply responsible for distribution in the US. Now it was time to strike a direct deal. And with this came a new influx of money for the boys in the band. Singer Paul Baloff, though, had been living off of money from a trust fund, and when that ran out, continued to act like he had a never-ending pot of gold, which didn't last for very long. Paul, in particular, struggled with looking after his money. When he joined the band, he was living off a trust fund his deceased parents had left him. But that money ran out eventually, and he continued to live the life of a guy who had never-ending funds. There was an end in sight, but he never saw it. So he parted. We all did. He eventually lost his house and ended up living in our rehearsal room. However, it wasn't just a lack of financial self-control that put Baloff in the crosshairs. Let's face it, in the 80s, everyone partied, so this really wasn't the main issue here. Exodus were looking to move up from a small-time thrash band, playing local keg parties, to touring professionally. They were looking to the likes of Metallica and Slayer, and basically saying that's where we should be. Paul had frequently struggled with his timing when we would play live. It wasn't unusual for me to sometimes have to go up and kick Paul in the leg to try to get him back on time when we were playing. So the verses were all out of sync. It was like an overdubbed kung fu movie, but that's part of the beauty of Paul. You never knew what you were going to get. We had a lot of people whispering in our ear at the time that the band would go further with someone else singing. Kicking him out was the hardest thing we ever did. It was a sad thing. Maybe the band's trajectory would have gone differently if we hadn't. Maybe we never would have achieved certain commercial success if he was still in the band, but maybe we would have hung on to our underground credibility and the rabid fan base. Who knows? Souza would be exposed to music from an early age, and many of these influences would be the same ones that initially guided Gary Holt into his own musical journey. My earliest influence is probably my dad. He was a tough biker guy, and he forced me to toughen up at an early age. There was nothing weak about the guy. Through him, I also discovered all my early musical influences, bands like UFO, Black Sabbath, Iron Maiden, Ted Nugent, AC/DC. He used to buy hard rock records for me when I was a kid. That's how I got my first Led Zeppelin record, as well as many others. So this seemed like a perfect fit for Exodus, and in 1987, they would release their second studio album, Pleasures of the Flesh. Although once again this record was almost delayed, much the same as their debut. The initial album cover was supposed to be an illustration depicting cannibals preparing their food. However, they went with this nice family-friendly photo instead. Pleasures of the Flesh would be the group's commercial foot in the door. It landed at number 166 on the US Billboard 200 on the 28th of November 1987 and spent an incredible 20 weeks on the chart, peaking at number 82. They were only a few positions under Motorhead's album Rock and Roll, and several spots above Anthrax's Among the Living. And of course, 1987 in general was a huge year for thrash. We had The Legacy by Testament, Taking Over by Overkill, and Slayer, Megadeth, and Metallica had all helped to push thrash into the mainstream by this point. Exodus were in the perfect position to go global. Pleasures of the Flesh would be seen by many as a technical thrash masterpiece. And within 2 years, Exodus would release their third studio album, Fabulous Disaster. Fabulous Disaster would debut at number 169 and again peak at number 82, spending 17 weeks on the Billboard 200.
Headbangers Ball continues. With me now as promised from Exodus, we have Rick and Gary.
They would also receive support from the now iconic MTV's Headbangers Ball.
Well, I don't know, it's this blend of, it's straight up metal, real heavy, but it's like, there's a whole, I call it thrash with class. Mm-hmm. That's what I like to call it. It's just like, it's real diverse, you know, it's got some bluesy stuff and some all-out thrash stuff, and it's great stuff.
This also included a slot on the MTV Headbangers Ball tour that featured Anthrax as headliners. Headbangers Ball would help to push Exodus to the masses by playing the music video for Toxic Waltz, and this record also featured an interesting cover. In 1975, an American funk band called War released a single called Lowrider, taken from their 7th studio album, Why Can't We Be Friends? Now, you may have never heard of this group, but I'd be surprised if you've never heard the song. And Exodus included their cover on the Fabulous Disaster LP. It might seem like a weird cover. Well, it is. However, Holt grew up around lowrider culture. He remembers hearing the riff on the radio and thinking it was heavy. And the title for this album itself came from the Sid and Nancy film released in 1986. An interesting combination. This was in the MTV era, when music television had a huge impact on the success, or lack thereof, of a band. Bands like Exodus didn't get played much on MTV's Headbangers Ball show. It mostly featured the likes of Motley Crue, Poison, Guns N' Roses, and Skid Row, who didn't really need the extra exposure. But in the last hour of the show, they'd throw in more extreme bands, and we actually got to see ourselves on TV, which was rad. You dream about that shit. Everything was going in the right direction for Exodus. Unfortunately though, their drummer Tom had to be hospitalized during the Headbangers Ball tour. They would look to Anthrax's drum tech, John Tempesta, to replace Tom. This wasn't just the end of Tom's tenure with Exodus though. This was the beginning of the end for Exodus themselves. Fabulous Disaster would be their highest charting album of this era, and although they still had 2 more ferocious records left in them, the timing of their entire career would come to be their biggest enemy. The impact of groove metal and grunge was imminent.
Every time you drink and drive, you always think that you'll survive till your car gets crushed and bent. Impact is imminent. It's heavy. It's heavy.
Exodus had spent the latter part of the 80s trying to build up a dedicated underground following, which they did, but they had bigger dreams for themselves. They wanted to join the ranks of their contemporaries such as Slayer and Metallica and get a piece of that commercial pie. Their contract with Combat Records was done and dusted, and they were eyeing up Capitol Records for their next deal. Capitol had allegedly tried to sign with Exodus whilst they were still with Combat Records. However, Combat wanted $1 million to release Exodus from their contract, so Exodus had to wait. Capitol Records could have been a huge step forward for Exodus. They'd put out records such as Iron Maiden's Power Slave, Inside the Electric Circus by Wasp, and had also been home to Megadeth since their 1986 record, Peace Sells, But Who's Buying? So when it came time for Exodus to release their 4th studio album, Impact is Imminent, in 1990, they were hoping to see a major shift in their career. However, the complete opposite happened. Impact is Imminent debuted on the Billboard 200 at number 150, but only reached 137, spending just 9 weeks on the chart. Capitol Records classed this as a commercial failure, and to rub even more salt into the wound, just a few months later, Megadeth would release Rust in Peace, also via Capitol. This LP debuted at number 51, peaked at number 23, and spent 30 weeks on the Billboard 200. Exodus only managed to hold on to a chart position for 9 weeks.
Anybody who comes to see Exodus already has emotional scars.
Or better get emotional scars.
Not only did Rust in Peace chart in multiple countries, whilst Impact only charted in America, Megadeth had already given Capitol a gold record with Peace Sells, But Who's Buying?, which received its gold certification in 1988. Capitol were basically hoping for another Megadeth in Exodus. Not only was this somewhat of a nail in the coffin for Exodus, It would seem their major label deal was kind of doomed from the start. The timing of this was made all the worse by the fact that when it was completed at the end of January 1990, everybody who'd been part of the journey to get assigned to Capitol was gone. Our A&R rep, Rachel Matthews, the head of A&R, and the president, all gone. They were replaced by people who had no attachment to Exodus whatsoever, musically or emotionally. The new people at Capitol were now like, who's this band? Not a good start for our major label career. Without crucial label support, all we could do was go out and tour once the album was released. And that is exactly what they did. However, Exodus would take another huge hit. They were lined up to go on tour with Judas Priest for 2 months across Europe. And I don't think I need to go into great detail here regarding the popularity of Priest around this era of heavy metal. This tour would have been in support of Judas Priest's now iconic album Painkiller, and would have been a huge win for the boys in Exodus. Unfortunately, a little known group called Pantera would end up taking their spot as Capitol Records simply didn't give Exodus the support they needed to secure the tour with Priest. All Exodus could do was keep chasing that dream. But then, of course, the Black Album happened. Exodus would release their 5th and final studio album of this era in 1992. A year prior to this, though, Metallica had basically killed traditional thrash metal with the Black Album. This album was arguably a key turning point for what type of commercial heavy metal people were willing to buy into. Almost every underground thrash band from the 80s that started to see any kind of success was almost dead and buried by the time this record hit the shelves. So when Exodus released Force of Habit, it was already too late. Exodus had once again been killed by timing, seemingly always one step behind. And we also had Pantera and Grunge that played almost an equal part in the demise of thrash and Exodus, although Gary Holt had a different theory. In the early 90s, a lot of metal bands, even some of our peers, were quick to blame grunge for their fading fortunes and getting dropped by their labels. Pantera blew up at the same time, flannel sales skyrocketed. So that tells you everything you need to know. Those guys were making records full of guitar solos and shredding and crushing riffs, and they succeeded because they managed to resonate. And I think all of us, with the exception of them and Metallica, weren't making our best albums anymore. Everybody wanted to blame it on someone else and not look in the mirror. I don't care if it's Exodus or Testament or Creator or anybody. We weren't making great albums in that period. It all fell apart. I was completely out of music. But I don't think this was quite the reason either. Force of Habit was still an absolute beast of an album. It just failed commercially as the general shift in what type of music was popular had drastically changed. Although Force of Habit did venture slightly into the territory of groove metal, Pantera had already beaten them to the punch. Quite literally. Exodus, though, was seemingly collapsing from within. During a press conference in Japan, Gary Holt announced that he was essentially leaving Exodus, and the band was over. Sitting in a press conference with the Japanese media, I unilaterally announced that this was the end of Exodus. I just said, these are our last shows, I'm done. The band's run was done, and it was time to move on. I always said the minute it became like a day job that I don't like, I'm out of there because it's not worth it. When you're uncomfortable in your own band and there are two totally different camps, to me, it was a no-brainer to break up. Quitting the way I did was a spur-of-the-moment decision that I probably should have thought on a little harder. Strangely, nobody in the band fought for it. So it appeared that nobody from Exodus was even happy anymore. Plus, they were all broke. As soon as they all got home, they had to find normal jobs. Exodus were just consistently unlucky. They were always just one step away from and 1 foot behind Metallica, Slayer, and Megadeth, and Anthrax. I can't help but wonder, if Exodus hadn't run into record label problems, band members that partied maybe a little too hard problems, would they actually be known as one of the big four? And if so, who would they have replaced? Metallica, Slayer, Anthrax, or Megadeth? If Dave Mustaine was never fired from Metallica, would Kirk Hammett have stayed with Exodus completely changing the course of one or maybe all of these heavy metal titans. Would the Black Album even exist? All of these questions and more are pretty pointless, as this is ultimately a history lesson, but interesting to muse over. The 5 albums Exodus released in the 80s and early 90s are absolutely 5 of the greatest thrash records ever released, and it's really a shame they didn't see more success. Exodus did reform, and they are still releasing records and touring with classic era members Gary Holt and Tom Hunting. They are, however, a completely different group now to what they came to be in the 80s. Regardless, Exodus have truly left their mark in the history books of heavy metal, and their music will always be bonded by blood. Of course, we already know that the music of all of these thrash legends will live on in the physical and digital age long after they are gone and long after you and I are gone. But are we going to live on in the digital sphere alongside them? I recently published a documentary on my new channel that investigates the possibility of platforms such as Facebook keeping you alive in a digital world after your death. You'll see a link on screen now and links below. Go give it a watch and subscribe to my new channel if that's your thing.